There's an overarching philosophy that can help govern what we do in rehearsals, and it's called being the composer's advocate. This is a term that was popularized by the conductor Erich Leinsdorf in a book of the same title. And what it means is that what we do is that we're essentially the servant of the composer, that we are there to advocate for his or her musical creation, the piece that they've written, and how we approach that in rehearsal. We want to make sure that we're honoring their intentions, that we're their advocate. Now, this isn't exactly the same thing as saying that we don't have any artistic license ourselves, that all we're there to do is simply be the proxy for the composer. One way of looking at it would be, well, one of my teachers, his name is Michael Voda at the University of Maryland, is fond of describing it this way, that if you're playing a piece and in rehearsal or in concert, and the composer walks into the room. Now, admittedly, that may not be possible because not all composers are still with us. But let's say, hypothetically, we're rehearsing Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and Beethoven walks into the room. We want him to stop, to listen, and then to essentially say, yeah, that's what I meant. That's what I was going for. But the question then becomes is, where is the line between being the composer's advocate and having some flexibility to express ourselves individually or as a group? Most composers understand that when they walk into the room, into this hypothetical situation, they're not looking for one specific way of having things sound. And if it's not exactly like that, well, then they're just not going to nod their head in agreement. They're just, oh, you're not doing exactly what I want, so forget it. Most composers understand that one of the beauties and advantages of live performance is that there's going to be a range of different solutions to the musical problem that they've created through their piece, and will allow for that range to happen. If they wanted complete control over every aspect of the piece, every single aspect, every detail, then they probably are going to go into computer music, which they can control every aspect. So the question is, since we know there's some flexibility most likely in what the composer will accept in our ability, our journey to be their advocate, the question is, where is that line? Well, there's certain things that are probably set in stone that we're not going to touch. For example, notes and rhythms. We're not going to, say a G on beat 3 and say, you know, I'd rather that be a G sharp. I'm going to change that to a G sharp. Probably not. That's the letter of the law, and we're not going to change it. Rhythm, same sort of thing. Let's say there's a quarter note on beat 4. We're not going to say, yeah, I'd like that to be a 4/16 notes. I'm just going to change that. Notes and rhythms are, generally speaking, off limits for us. But there is still beyond that some flexibility between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. For example, tempo. A composer might write quarter note equals 144 in the piece. Well, there's two reasons we might not take it 144. One would be a practical reason, and the other would be an expressive reason. The practical reason would say, well, we may not have an ensemble that can perform it at 144. If we took it that fast, it may just be a train wreck. We might say, you know, if we take it 128, it's going to be not the letter of the law, but it's going to be the spirit of the piece. We're going to better satisfy our role as the composer's advocate. From an expressive point of view, we might change it because, well, let's say we want to take it 152. We might say, I think the composer, what they're going for here at 144 is a certain style, and we can amp that up by taking it 152 without jettisoning some of the other clarity issues that might happen. Or say, we're going to take it 138, a hair slower, but we're still going to be incredibly vibrant with our articulation, and we're going to bring out some details that maybe we couldn't get at 144. So there is an expressive purpose to that too, an expressive reason to change what's on the page also. We have to find our way through that. One of the main ways we do that is through our score study. That's part of the goal of that, to figure out what is the composer going for here? What does the piece mean, however we define that? What are the things that he or she is prioritizing as a composer, and how can we best express that through the way we eventually wind up performing the piece? So, beyond tempo, we can look at something like articulation. There might be something, an articulation that's in the woodwinds, that our woodwinds can't play. Well, they just physically can't do it. Well, an practical reason for changing it would be that they can't play it that fast. So we're going to, instead of we're going to play it dia-da-da-dia-da-da-dia-da-da, slur to, tongue to, dia-da-da-dia-da-da-dia-da-da-dia-da-da-dia-da-da. It's not the letter of the law, but we're hoping it achieves the spirit of the law by creating the same style in something that we can technically achieve, and thus we can satisfy our role as the composer's advocate. Or maybe there's an expressive reason that we change what the articulation is. Perhaps the cellos have tenuto quarter notes, something like da 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 da. That's what's written. But we say, if we do that, we're going to cover another line. So we're going to create a little more separation, da, 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 and stretch the meaning of tenuto, as no pun intended. Or maybe we want to create more separation to create more distinction between that cello line and another line. So there might be an expressive reason that we change what's on the page. It's not notes and rhythms, it's something else. Dynamics is something that's often adjusted. The composer might write mezzo forte and piano over here. Okay, well, they might mean that literally, but very often for a practical reason, we might have to say, I know the horns are written there mezzo piano, but we only have 2 horns, or our horns don't play that strong. So we're going to change it, mezzo piano, to mezzo forte in order to make sure that line comes out based on what we think needs to sound. It's a practical reason. We might do it for an expressive reason. The horns might be mezzo piano, but we might say, that line, we would really like to hear that in counterpoint to another line. Based on our score study, we're going to value those two voices. So we might boost the level up there a little bit, so change what the printed dynamics are. So there's some wiggle room there with dynamics, in the service of trying to serve as the composer's advocate. Instrumentation is another one, and this gets a little controversial sometimes. The classic example is Mahler, the composer Gustav Mahler, would have famously changed the orchestration to some Beethoven symphonies. His argument was, well, if Beethoven had the technological resources that he had in terms of valved brass instruments, he might have written those parts a little bit differently. So Mahler is going to go in and make those adjustments on Beethoven's behalf, trying to serve the composer. Well, it's a reasonable way of looking at it, but the flip side of that argument would be that, no, look, Beethoven knew what he was doing. He knew the limitations of the instruments he had at his disposal, and he wrote accordingly. So we don't have to change anything whatsoever. Well, that's also a reasonable argument. So this is something you just have to figure out your way, and it depends a little bit on your own philosophy. It depends on the piece and the situation and the composer. So for a practical reason, let's say there's a line in the trombones, and we just can't hear it. It's written only for the trombones. Well, maybe we also write it for the horns. Maybe we double it in the cellos. Or you can think of all sorts of instrumental combinations that, all right, we're going to write it that's in the violas, but we don't have many violas, or we can't hear them, or they're not very strong. So we're going to double it in the second violins if it's within their range. All right, that's a practical reason that we're changing what the composer wrote to serve the intent, to advocate for that line coming out. Well, an expressive reason for changing the orchestration might be something similar. We might say, we really want to beef up to bolster that viola line. So, although the composer didn't write it, we're going to take the liberty to double it in another voice. It might be reasonable. It might say, well, your score study says that's important, and the composer just, may have made a little bit of a mistake. Well, it's possible. The other way of looking at it, which is also reasonable, is that, no, the composer knew the color combinations that he or she were playing with. Says, I only want the viola sound there. Figure out a way to make the viola sound dominate without mixing it with something else in the palette. So there's a lot of gray area here, and it's a fascinating discussion when we can't come up with a one answer right here, but it's something that's worth going through for yourself and figuring out where you stand on these issues. We have a really good notation system in Western music right now. It's good in a lot of ways. I mean, it's very specific for notes and for rhythms, and we can put a lot of expressive details in there from a notation point of view. But in other ways, it doesn't allow us to show certain subtleties and nuances and very specific bits of phrasing. We write crescendo, but if we put too much a crescendo, a decrescendo, a little bit of rubato, it gets very cluttered as we try to get specific. Not to mention that some composers just simply don't want to micromanage what's going on. And that's often what's really the issue here. That even if the piece says piano, and 8 measures later says, say, forte, with a crescendo, that doesn't mean that the composer necessarily expects that all there's going to be is a completely smooth, even, and predictable crescendo from piano to forte over the 8 measures. That might be one solution, but perhaps it's also reasonable to say, well, we're going to have a small crescendo here, then we're going to back off a bit, and then a final big crescendo, 2 mini crescendos embedded within the larger one. It's these sort of details that composers would often expect us to put in. Different eras of music actually have different densities of musical expression information in the score. If you look at a medieval or Renaissance or even Baroque and classical score, they will often usually have much less information, if any, about dynamics, expressive details, accents, articulation, compared to a 20th or 21st century piece where composers are usually very good about putting those details in. But that doesn't mean that the Renaissance composer didn't expect there to be any dynamics, or that he only expected there to simply be a piano and a forte. Nothing else. No shaping or phrasing within that. No, they probably expected there to be a lot more expression in there. And one way we know that, well, we don't have any recordings, but we can read treatises and essays about performance in those eras, and we can clearly see that they are saying, oh yeah, there's going to be expression that's not on the page that we expect you to add as performers. So again, there's this tension in a good way between being the composer's advocate and expressing ourselves as individuals or as an ensemble. There's also the issue of performance practice. And a modern day example of this is jazz swing. That when a jazz composer writes a piece today, they don't necessarily write a note at the top that says these 2 eighth notes should be played like a triplet sort of figure. Do-da becomes do-da-do-da-do-da-do-ba-do-ba. Well, we know if we're playing jazz that that's probably what it's going to be unless they specifically write otherwise. Composers don't write that because it's the performance practice. It's assumed that if you're playing in this idiom, you're going to play in that manner. Well, the issue of performance practice can be applied throughout music history. There was a performance practice for Mozart, for Haydn, for Renaissance music, for medieval music. It's not necessarily on the score. It's incumbent upon us to do a little bit of research to find out what it is, and to know that, say, a Mozart forte piano or a Mozart accent is very different from a Stravinsky forte piano and a Stravinsky accent. They look the same on the page, but they're played very differently, and we have to do that. The composer's not going to tell us that. They assume we already know. A Wagnerian legato passage or expressive passage will probably be played differently than a Renaissance expressive legato passage. In Wagner, you're probably going to connect each note as intensely as possible, whereas in the Renaissance music, we might put a little more separation, even in a legato passage. Looks the same on the page if you factor out the fact that we have different harmonic languages that we're dealing with, but besides that, the notation is going to look the same on the page, but there's different performance practices that we're going to apply. Another example, if we look at Mozart, could be the way we treat slurs. Often in Mozart, if we have, say, 5 notes slurred together, di-do-do-do-dum, that's often going to be played with a decrescendo. He doesn't write it in the part, but the performance practice was often di-do-do-do-dum, ta-do-do-do-dum. Not always, and there are actually writings about, well, how do we treat these sorts of figures? So it's incumbent upon us to know the traditions and apply them, to do our score study, to do our research, mostly as we work to serve as the composer's advocate.